welcome Ruth back to our Bima. She's been here before. She's no stranger to Temple Sinai. Ruth spent over 20 years working with youth and adults impacted by domestic and sexual violence before becoming the inaugural executive director of the Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence in May of 2019. Ruth has her master's in social work from the University of Pennsylvania and also is trained as a community organizer. She's particularly interested in creating models of trauma-informed advocacy and policymaking. Outside of her coalition work, Ruth is very involved in local interfaith organizing, is an avid knitter and foodie, and is the proud mom of 2 incredible young adults. She's also here with her husband, Dan. So I'd like to invite Ruth Zakarin up to give our Devar Torah this evening.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Everyone can hear me? Terrific. It is very good to be with you all this Shabbat. Thank you, Rabbi Meszler, for having me again. Thank you to the congregation for welcoming me back. It is a full circle moment for me. I think one of the first times I spoke publicly after coming to the coalition was here. And next week, I celebrate my 7th anniversary leading the coalition. So it is lovely to mark that, being back in the congregation with all of you. So as Rabbi Meszler mentioned, just a bit more about who I am in the world and the lens that I bring to this work. I'm actually looking at the congregation and seeing some faces of people who knew me in my prior world working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And as Rabbi Meszler mentioned, I spent decades doing that work. Everything from shelter to community-based child witness to violence, batterers intervention, rape crisis work. And as you can imagine, when you are working with survivors, the issue of guns and people being less safe in their homes and their communities because of guns comes up all the time. And my work with survivors and safety planning when their abuser had access to a gun brought me very close to the impact of gun violence in our communities and our homes. But for the 11 years that I worked in Brockton, it was working with children in the aftermath of a domestic violence homicide that really got me thinking about this issue, not just in terms of how to respond to it, but what we could do to prevent the trauma from happening again. And as Rabbi Meszler mentioned, my husband Daniel and I are the proud parents of 2 young adults. They are now 24, but they turned 16 the day the shooting at Parkland happened. And because they were in USY, a national youth group, they had a friend who went to school there. And it was a real moment for me as we are about to celebrate our children's birthday and they are wondering whether their friend survived. That also got me thinking about the impact of guns in our society. So this is the lens that I bring to my work at the Coalition as a trauma clinician, a survivor advocate, and a mom. And my work is truly about preventing the trauma from ever happening to any other family so that no child has to bury a parent lost to gun violence, and no parent has to bury a child lost to violence either. So with that orientation, I was very proud to be called upon to lead the coalition. And at the time, I was the first full-time staff member. So it was really at the beginning of the blossoming of a new nonprofit, had been led before by a group of incredibly dedicated volunteers, including people from faith communities like this one. Temple Beth Elohim was one of the first congregations involved in the coalition, along with other faith communities, along with the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, who we will be with this Sunday, and other folks who wanted to come together to work in coalition and community to stop the trauma of gun violence. And since then, we have grown. We are now a gigantic staff of 6. But compared to being the only full-time staff member, it feels huge to me. We have 2 interns too, so we're all in the office together. I'm like, where did all these people come from? But it's given us the opportunity to really think critically about who we are and how we approach the issue of gun violence prevention. And just to share a bit with you about that orientation, we see our work as preventing trauma, as addressing gun violence as a public health crisis, as the public health crisis that it is. We see gun violence as a public health crisis that is driven by racial and economic disparity, that requires strengthening our policies, investing in sustained and meaningful ways in community-based solutions, and lifting up data and research. We know that when we do all of these things, we can move the needle on gun violence. And that is the approach that we take at the Coalition. We see our work in 4 pillars, one being advocacy, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. A lot of that work is at the State House level, but also at the local level. We dip our toes into the federal work, but our focus is really here on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We do a great deal of education and awareness, workshops, lunch and learns, which we do every month. We have a lot of educational materials. We're about to launch a whole new resource library on our website, which I'm super excited about. So that is a big part of what we do as well. We do a lot of community organizing. Our organizer is working in communities most impacted by gun violence with an emphasis on engaging young people and what solutions look like. Every place she goes, she asks the question, what does safety look like to you? So that their answers can inform our work. And our last pillar is coalition building. I like to joke that my middle name is now Coalition because I do believe that the only way forward is together. We now have over 120 member organizations from across the Commonwealth as well as the national partners. Those member orgs are represented on our leadership team. They inform all of our work. They are the heart and soul of how we approach this issue. We try to show up for our member orgs like this Sunday at the Mother's Day Walk for Peace, but they show up for us all the time. And we know that we work in that unified voice. That's what builds power. That's what makes change. So coalition building is truly at the heart of what we do. And a couple of years ago, it was 2022, it was the end of a legislative session. The Supreme Court handed down a decision called Bruin, which you may be familiar with. If you're not, it was a decision based on New York's gun laws, but it had impact here in Massachusetts. And at the time, our work became responding to that and figuring out what that was going to mean for our policies here in the Commonwealth. But when that happened, our State House leaders made a promise that they were going to go into the next legislative session and work on a comprehensive response to gun violence. And then we got to work. We built coalition with the national partners like Brady and Giffords in every town, our member organizations here in the Commonwealth, and we started dreaming a bit about what that comprehensive response could look like. We had a really long list, and we started advocating. Did a lot of stomping around the State House, banging our pots in front of the State House, lots of meetings, lots of public events. And in July of 2024, I was very honored to stand next to the governor when she signed this comprehensive response into law, an act modernizing firearms laws. As I mentioned before, we believe that the way we move the needle is strong policies, sustained investment in community-based solutions, and lifting up data and research. This legislation does all of those things. It strengthens policies like regulating ghost guns for the first time in the history of the Commonwealth. If you're not familiar with that term, that refers to someone assembling a gun in their own home. It is unserialized, therefore untraceable, and considered a ghost gun. That happens by either buying the parts or buying a kit through the mail with up to 80% of the parts of a gun. It is no longer legal to mail those kits into the Commonwealth. So we're trying to swim upstream and have policies that decrease the flow of these guns into our communities. There's a piece around how we look at equity and funding for community violence intervention. We have a whole oversight committee that I've testified in front of to make sure that we're doing this well in the Commonwealth. So that's the sustained investment in community-based solutions. And we have a data and research piece, the crime gun data analysis bill that got included in this legislation, which compels the state to do more with the trace data, collected from guns in the aftermath of a crime. And that data now lives in a publicly facing data dashboard. And we wrote the language into the bill to make that happen. And that data dashboard went live in November so that we can understand where the guns are coming from, but also anyone, including anyone sitting here, can access that information. We can't address a problem unless we understand it. And this data dashboard will help us better understand the scope of the problem in Massachusetts. So that's just a few highlights of what's in the legislation. It's actually 116 pages. So if you're looking for a little bit of light reading, let me know, and I can direct you to all of that information, but a summary of this legislation lives on the Coalition's website. And I share that with you just so you know a bit about what is in there, because after July of 2024, we had about 2 weeks of celebration, and then we found out that the local arm of the NRA was starting to collect signatures to put a question on the 2026 ballot, so this year, that is about whether we keep this law or repeal it in its entirety. How many of you have been hearing about ballot questions in Massachusetts this year? And there's going to be about 92 of them, which I'm exaggerating, but only a bit. There could be 10, 11, or 12 questions on your ballot this November, and this is the only one that we know for sure will be on the ballot. So in response to that, and to protect this critically important legislation, we formed a committee called Vote Yes for a Safe Massachusetts. And I am proud to serve as chair of that committee. We have many people joining us for the work of building coalition and community to make sure that we protect this critically important law from repeal. And that is what I'm here to share with you a bit today. That was a really long preamble to get to this point. But I want to invite you all to get involved in our work with Vote Yes for a Safe Massachusetts. I'm very glad to call Rabbi Meszler a partner in this work. I know this is something that you care deeply about, and I'm very grateful for your advocacy and your partnership on this issue. So Vote Yes for a Safe Massachusetts is really about having conversations in every community in the Commonwealth, not just about the importance of protecting the strong foundation that we have built here in Massachusetts, but also to have conversations about what actually keeps our communities safe. Because ultimately, this work is about safety. It's about keeping our communities safe, our children safe, our places of worship safe. Our opposition has a lot of feelings about rights and concerns that we are somehow trying to take away their rights and their civil liberties. And one thing that I do want to say very clearly is that there's nothing in this legislation that disrupts a legal pathway to owning a gun. What it does do is put regulations and guardrails in place, again, to keep people safe. So I invite all of you, if you would like to learn more, we have many resources to help you do that. I invite all of you to be a part of this conversation about safety and what it means to keep our communities safe from gun violence, because I believe that we all have a right to that safety. And this is, again, what this work is about. I am forever a trauma clinician, a survivor advocate, and a mom. And I come to this work of protecting this legislation from all of those perspectives. At the Coalition, we see every shooting as both a crisis and a call to action. We want to move the work forward, and while Massachusetts has some of the lowest rates of gun violence in the entire country, we will not rest until we bring that rate down to zero so that no family has to go through the trauma of losing a loved one to gun violence. But we also know that in order to move the work forward, we need to protect the strong foundation that we have already built. And again, that's what this effort is about. I'll leave you with one final thought. How many of you have heard the saying, drinking from a fire hose of news? So many of us. And I think a lot of folks are feeling like they are drinking from a fire hose of news. I switch up that analogy a little bit, I see it as a storm or a deluge that is coming at us of just so much bad news all of the time. And while it is very hard to withstand all of that, the thing that keeps me going is that every time we pass a strong policy, that we do invest in a community-based solution, that we build coalition, that we show up for each other, that we help our neighbors, we are opening up an umbrella to protect us from that storm, from that deluge, or we are creating a Sukkot Shalom, a shelter of peace. This work is about making a very, very large Sukkot Shalom for the Commonwealth and making sure that everybody gets to live a life of peace and gets to have the right to be safe in whatever zip code, whatever neighborhood they walk in, that they have an equal right to be safe wherever they go. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Ruth, and Shabbat Shalom. When I was a kid, I remember a discussion in my house, because I desperately wanted to be Han Solo from Star Wars, and there was a toy of a laser gun, and that they bought for me, I think probably one Hanukkah or something, and I then ran around the house shooting people with it. And like most kids, I thought, guns were cool. And I also remember being on my trip to Israel at my junior year of college, and really a first exposure to gun because an Israeli soldier did something really that they were not supposed to do. I got on the bus and there was an Uzi on my seat. They had left it behind, which is a big no-no. And I just, again, remember, how cool is that? But the coolness, and what I've now learned is really an American form of idolatry of guns, hit home later when I was in rabbinical school, and I remember, my classmate's friend was shot and murdered outside of his place of business in Chicago, and I drove from Cincinnati to Chicago for Shiva. Then I went to Washington Hebrew and I heard stories. I heard a story about a family where their baby was shot through the head by another child who had found the family gun that was not properly stored. And then there was all the news of the school shootings, and of course the local news. And so suddenly the idea of guns became much more about necessary tools for defense, for law enforcement, but not so cool anymore in terms of playthings. And it's not a secret that we have a child at Brown who lived through the shooting at Brown University this past year and was locked up in a place of business until it was safe to go outside. So I think that this impacts all of us. I'm sure you have stories too, and it's not very far away. And the opposition always wants to say that we're infringing upon rights and that we want to confiscate their guns. What we want is that guns are treated the same way as automobiles, that they need to be trained and registered and handled responsibly. And when you drill down into what the actual content of these laws are, that you should do a background check for someone before they purchase a gun, usually nobody disagrees with that. When the opposition, when the people who put this petition together, when we found out that they got a lot of their funding from Smith & Wesson, suddenly it's, are you really about rights? Or are you really about your bottom line? Because selling ghost guns can be a cash cow for you. How atrocious. What an abomination. Last I checked in the Torah, child sacrifice is an abomination. So I care about gun violence because, of course, I care about the safety of our institution. Anti-Semitism is at a very high rate here, and so, of course, I necessarily care about guns. I feel better with a police officer who is armed at our institution. So it's, again, not about the guns. It's about whether it's a firearm free-for-all. And I also care because, as a human being and an American, it's astounding to me that the #1 cause of death in the United States of ages children 1 to 17 is at the end of a firearm. More than disease, more than automobiles. It's a very specific form of American idolatry. And we can change that. But the only way we keep our gun laws is by going and voting in November, voting yes. You have to vote yes to keep the gun laws, and no would be repealing the laws. And so that's what we need to do. That's what we need to do when we get to that ballot. After everybody, you vote for everybody, and then it's got the ballot questions, the yes and no at the bottom. We have to vote yes for a safe Massachusetts. And I thank Ruth for teaching us, and I want to lift up the words from the Torah of this week that are not just in this week's Torah portion, but inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, to proclaim freedom, to proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof. Freedom means safety. Freedom means freedom from fear. Freedom means the obligation to go and vote to keep that freedom. So thank you, Ruth, and Shabbat Shalom. We're going to